Picture this centuries ago, in the heart of medieval Europe, a group of stonecutters, carpenters, and glassmakers gathered under the open sky, their hands calloused, their tools simple, their vision nothing short of miraculous. They weren't just building walls or roofs, they were reaching for the heavens, crafting cathedrals so immense, so breathtaking, that even today they defy belief. These weren't just structures, they were acts of faith, testaments to human ingenuity, and monuments to perseverance that took generations to complete. Think about the sheer audacity of it, without modern cranes, without steel beams, without even the precise mathematical tools we take for granted. These craftsmen lifted stone upon stone, arch upon arch, until their creations scraped the sky. How did they do it? What drove them to push the limits of what seemed possible? And what can their triumphs and their struggles teach us about the power of human determination? The story of these cathedrals isn't just about architecture, it's about people. It's about the quarry workers who spent years extracting perfect blocks of stone, the blacksmiths who forged tools strong enough to shape them, and the glassmakers who transformed sand into radiant stained glass that told stories in light and color. It's about the stonemasons who balanced on precarious scaffolding, trusting their calculations and their teamwork to keep them from disaster. And it's about the communities that poured their savings, their labor, and their hopes into these projects, believing they were building something far greater than themselves. Every chisel mark, every carved gargoyle, every soaring vault was a declaration that with skill, patience, and unwavering belief, even the impossible could be made real. But behind every triumph lay trials that would have broken lesser spirits. Imagine the heartbreak when a half-finished tower collapsed after years of work, or the frustration of inventing new techniques on the fly because no one had ever built something so tall, so delicate before. Think of the winters spent shivering in unfinished naves, the summers battling exhaustion under the scorching sun, the constant fear that one misstep could undo decades of effort. Yet, through it all, these craftsmen persevered, driven by something deeper than ambition, by a vision of beauty, of glory, of touching the divine. And today, when we stand beneath those vaulted ceilings, bathed in kaleidoscopic light, we're not just seeing stone and glass, we're witnessing the legacy of their courage. So let's step into their world, uncover their secrets, and discover how these ordinary men achieved the extraordinary one stone at a time. The 12th century marked a turning point in architectural history when the heavy, fortress-like walls of Romanesque churches gave way to something entirely new: the Gothic cathedral, a structure that seemed to defy gravity itself. Where older buildings felt grounded and solid, these new creations soared, their spires piercing the clouds like stone prayers. The secret lay in a series of breakthroughs that transformed not just how buildings looked, but how they stood. Pointed arches borrowed from Islamic architecture channeled weight more efficiently than rounded Romanesque ones, allowing ceilings to climb higher. Ribbed vaults crisscrossed overhead like the bones of some colossal stone beast, distributing pressure along graceful lines that turned the roof into a lattice of strength and beauty. But the true marvel was the flying buttress, those elegant stone arms that reached out from the walls like a dancer's outstretched limbs. By shifting the burden of the roof outward, these supports turned what had once been thick, windowless walls into delicate frames for the Gothic cathedral's most breathtaking feature: stained glass. Sunlight streaming through those jewel-toned panes didn't just illuminate the space, it transformed it. Biblical scenes glowed in ruby reds and sapphire blues, turning the nave into a shimmering storybook of faith. For medieval worshippers, stepping inside was like entering heaven itself, a realm where light became divine language and stone dissolved into radiance. Yet for all their spiritual symbolism, these innovations weren't born from pure idealism. They were hard-won solutions to very real problems. Builders pushing their craft to new heights literally risked their lives. When the choir vaults of Bovey's Cathedral collapsed in 1284, it was a grim reminder that ambition often outpaced understanding. Every flying buttress had to be precisely angled, every arch perfectly balanced, or the entire structure could tumble like a house of cards. And then there were the human challenges, coordinating hundreds of craftsmen across decades, securing funding from nobles and townspeople alike, even negotiating with rival guilds whose cooperation could make or break a project. What emerged from this crucible of trial and error was more than just a new style. It was a testament to what happens when faith, artistry, and sheer stubbornness collide. What's astonishing is how quickly this revolution spread. Within a generation, the Gothic style leaped from the workshops of France's Île-de-France region to England, Germany, Spain, and beyond. Each region put its own spin on the form: the vertical exuberance of French cathedrals, the sprawling horizontals of English ones, the brick-built wonders of the Baltic, yet all shared that same soaring spirit. It's as if medieval Europe had been waiting for this moment, ready to trade fortress-like churches for buildings that reached, quite literally, for the sky. And in doing so, they left us not just monuments, but a question. When faced with the impossible, do we build walls, or do we build wings? The men who raised these stone giants into the sky were far more than simple laborers. They were masters of their crafts, artists in stone and wood and glass, bound together by guilds that functioned like medieval universities of trade. Picture a stonemason scrutinizing a block of limestone, his eye judging its grain and flaws before his chisel ever touched it, or a glassmaker blending metals into molten sand to create hues no one had seen before. These weren't just jobs, they were lifelong callings, often starting in childhood when boys were apprenticed to a master, sweeping workshop floors in exchange for the first secrets of the trade. Guilds ruled this world with near religious solemnity. To become a master mason might take a decade or more, years spent mixing mortar, carving practice pieces, and proving not just skill but character. The rituals were steeped in mystery. Some guilds even required candidates to create a masterpiece, a term we still use today to prove their worth. And woe to anyone who leaked guild secrets. Fines, exile, or worse awaited those who broke their oaths. Yet within this strict hierarchy flowed a river of innovation. Take Villard de Honnecourt, whose 13th century sketchbook survives as a rare window into their minds. His pages overflow with precise geometric diagrams, sketches of machinery, even whimsical doodles of animals, proof that these builders balanced mathematical rigor with creative flair. What's striking is how little we know of most of them. Unlike today's architects whose names grace plaques and blueprints, medieval master builders often vanished into their own creations. A few, like Peter Parler of Prague Cathedral or William of Sense at Canterbury, earned recognition, but countless others left only their handiwork as signatures. Yet anonymity didn't mean carelessness. Every cornerstone they laid, every statue they carved, carried the weight of eternity, because they believed quite literally that God was watching. The true miracle lies in how they worked. No CD software, no structural engineers, just compasses, plumb lines, and generations of hard-won knowledge passed mouth to ear. When a master mason traced a full-scale blueprint directly onto a cathedral's floor, a practice called setting out, he was drawing on centuries of trial and error encoded into his fingertips. And when a team hoisted a multi-ton stone block using nothing but ropes, pulleys, and human sweat, they were performing a feat modern engineers still marvel at. But mastery came at a cost. The work was brutal, backs bent under the weight of stones, lungs choked with dust, fingers worn raw from endless carving. Accidents were commonplace. Scaffolds collapsed, ropes snapped, and one misjudged arch could bury years of labor in rubble. Yet they persisted, driven by something deeper than wages, the chance to leave a mark on history that would outlive them by centuries. Today, when we trace the delicate veins of a leaf carved high on a capital where no one but birds would see it, we're glimpsing their quiet defiance, proof that even in anonymity, excellence endures. And then there were the materials themselves, the very bones of these cathedrals. Quarries miles away yielded limestone so pure it could be carved like butter, yet withstand centuries of weather. Oak trees older than memory became roof beams, their curves shaped by nature's own hand, and glassmakers, alchemists of light, turned sand and metal into windows that glowed like trapped sunsets. But getting these materials to the site was a saga in itself, a tale of ox carts sinking into muddy roads, of rivers commandeered as highways for stone barges, of entire towns mobilized to haul blocks too massive for modern trucks. The cathedral wasn't just built, it was won piece by piece from an indifferent world. Imagine swinging a hammer against solid rock from dawn till dusk, your hands blistered, your shoulders screaming, as you painstakingly carve out blocks larger than a grown man. This was the daily reality for quarry workers, the unsung heroes whose labor literally laid the foundation for every medieval cathedral. Their work began far from the soaring spires, in muddy pits and cliffside quarries where teams tackled stone with nothing but muscle and iron. The best limestone came from specific regions, like the creamy white Keene stone from Normandy, prized for its workability and durability, but extracting it was a science in itself. Workers would trace natural fissures in the rock, then drive iron wedges into the cracks with sledgehammers, sometimes heating the wedges with fire to expand the metal and split the stone with a thunderous crack. Precision mattered as much as brute strength. A careless strike could ruin a block destined to become part of a vault or column, wasting weeks of effort. Seasoned quarrymen developed an almost intuitive sense for the stone's grain, like bakers kneading dough. They knew when to strike hard and when to ease up. And the risks were constant. Cave-ins, flying rock shards, and collapsing scaffolds claimed lives regularly, a grim reminder that every ton of cathedral stone was paid for in blood and sweat. Once freed from the earth, these monoliths faced a journey as daunting as their extraction. Picture a 20-ton block loaded onto a sled dragged by oxen, inching along roads that turned to quagmires in the rain. Some quarries were lucky enough to be near rivers, where barges could carry the stone, though unloading it at the construction site required ingenuity. Cranes powered by human treadwheels like giant hamster wheels hoisted blocks skyward with ropes woven from hemp or leather. But the true magic happened when these rough-hewn stones reached the masons' yards. Here, master craftsmen transformed raw rock into geometric perfection. Using string lines, wooden templates, and compasses, they shaped each block to fit its exact role in the cathedral's puzzle. A single arch might require dozens of uniquely tapered stones called voussoirs, each carved to distribute weight precisely. The mason's marks, small chiseled symbols on each piece, acted like medieval barcodes, ensuring credit or blame for the quality of work. What's astonishing is how these craftsmen compensated for nature's unpredictability. Stone isn't uniform. Hidden flaws like cracks or soft spots could doom a load-bearing column. Yet medieval masons developed an eagle eye for spotting weaknesses. sometimes repurposing flawed stones for less critical areas or reinforcing them with iron clamps. Their adaptability shines in cathedrals like Chartres, where subtle variations in stone color reveal how builders shifted quarries mid-construction, blending different materials seamlessly into the whole. This relentless cycle quarry, transport, carve, repeat, continued for decades on a single site. The workers knew most wouldn't live to see the finished cathedral, yet they poured their skill into every block. Perhaps that's why these stones feel alive even today. Hold your palm against a weathered cathedral wall, and you're touching more than rock. You're touching the stubborn patience of people who believed ordinary hands could shape the divine. Standing in a mason's yard, surrounded by half-carved blocks and the rhythmic tap-tap of chisels, you'd witness a transformation as deliberate as it was magical. Each stone began as a rough, shapeless mass, but under skilled hands, it became a precise geometric puzzle piece, one that had to fit flawlessly alongside hundreds of others. The tools were simple, wooden templates shaped like the arches and columns they'd become, string lines stretched taut as bowstrings to guide straight edges, and compasses for scribing perfect curves. But the true instrument was the mason's eye, trained over decades to judge angles and surfaces with near-superhuman accuracy. Consider the voussoirs, those wedge-shaped stones that form an arch. Cut even slightly wrong, the entire structure could buckle under its own weight. Yet medieval masons achieved joints so precise that mortar was almost an afterthought. At Durham Cathedral, stones locked together so tightly that 9 centuries of English weather haven't loosened them. This wasn't just craftsmanship, it was a kind of alchemy, turning brute rock into weightless elegance. Hidden details reveal their obsession with perfection. High on cathedral walls, where no human eye would ever scrutinize them, stone flowers bloom with petals thinner than a finger's width. Grotesques leer from rainspouts, their expressions sharp enough to startle even after 800 years. And all of it was carved upside down or sideways on the ground before being hoisted into place, a mental gymnastics we can scarcely fathom today. Mistakes were unthinkable. A misjudged cut meant weeks of lost labor and precious stone ruined. That's why every block bore a mason's marker, a unique chiseled symbol like a stonemason's signature. These weren't just for pride, they were a quality control system. If a stone failed, the master builder knew whose bench to visit. Some marks even appear in accounting ledgers, proving these artisans were paid by the piece, not the hour. Yet for all their precision, these masons weren't rigid technicians. They adapted on the fly, compensating for quirks in the stone or last-minute design changes. At Lincoln Cathedral, you can spot clever fixes, blocks subtly reshaped to fill gaps, or decorative elements added to mask irregularities. Their genius lay in making improvisation look intentional. Now imagine the moment when these stones left the yard, ready for their ascent. Teams of laborers maneuvered them onto wooden sledges, greased with animal fat to ease their slide toward the growing cathedral. Overhead, the skeletal outline of a wooden crane loomed, its massive treadwheel waiting for men to step inside like human hamsters, their weight and muscle turning the mechanism that would lift each block skyward. The real test was about to begin, because fitting stones on solid ground was one thing, but securing them 100 feet in the air with wind whistling through the scaffolding was another challenge entirely. High above the clamor of the construction site, a massive wooden treadwheel crane creaked under the weight of a 2-ton block of limestone, its ropes groaning as 6 laborers trudged in endless circles inside the wheel's hollow core. This was the medieval equivalent of a skyscraper's elevator, a feat of engineering that turned human sweat into vertical momentum. Picture the scene, men straining against the wheel's inertia, their coordinated steps lifting stone after stone to masons waiting on precarious wooden scaffolds, their platforms lashed together with ropes and faith. These cranes weren't just tools, they were symphonies of teamwork where a single misstep could send a block careening downward, crushing everything in its path. The ingenuity of these devices still astonishes. Some cranes were powered by winches, their thick hemp ropes coiled around barrels as teams pulled in unison. Others, like the great treadwheel at England's Canterbury Cathedral, functioned like giant hamster wheels, harnessing the collective strength of workers walking uphill inside the machine itself. The physics were elegant. The wheel's diameter acted as a natural lever, multiplying human effort to hoist weights unimaginable for the era. But elegance didn't mean safety. Records from the building of Salisbury Cathedral note laborers falling from rotten scaffolding, ropes snapping under overloaded strain, and even entire cranes collapsing when their wooden frames fatigued. Every lift was a gamble, every load a prayer. What's often overlooked is the silent partner in this dance, the pulley. Simple yet revolutionary, these grooved wheels redirected force, allowing a single rope to do the work of many. By threading ropes through multiple pulleys in a block and tackle system, medieval builders effectively invented mechanical advantage. Suddenly, a team of 4 could lift what once required 20, their efforts amplified by clever physics. The same principle let them maneuver stones into impossible positions, angling a block through a narrow window opening, or suspending a carved saint mid-air while masons adjusted its final placement. Yet for all their innovation, these builders faced a paradox. The higher they climbed, the more the earth itself pushed back. A cathedral's soaring walls didn't just battle gravity, they wrestled with wind, rain, and the slow creep of settling foundations. That's where the flying buttress became their secret weapon, those graceful stone arcs channeling the roofs thrust outward into sturdy piers. Think of it as a cathedral's exoskeleton, a bony structure bracing the fragile glass skin within. But even buttresses had limits. When Bovey's cathedral's choir vaults collapsed twice in the 13th century, it was a brutal lesson in overreach. Builders learned to embed iron rods within the stone, creating tension rings that acted like invisible hands clasping the structure together, the true marvel. They did it all without blueprints as we know them. Master masons worked from full-scale drawings scratched onto tracing floors, temporary wooden surfaces where every arch and column was laid out in chalk or paint, like a life-sized puzzle. Teams would refer to these ghostly lines as they carved stones below, then send them aloft to slot into place. It was architecture by memory and muscle, where the plan existed in collective minds as much as on any surface. And through it all, the rhythm never stopped. The clang of blacksmiths shaping iron cramps to lock stones together, the hiss of wet mortar being slathered between blocks, the shouts of overseers directing deliveries, each sound a thread in the cacophony of creation. For every stone that reached the summit, hundreds of hands had touched it, quarrymen, carters, carvers, and climbers, all part of a chain stretching back to the earth itself. Today, when we gaze up at those spires, we're not just seeing stone, we're witnessing the echo of countless ordinary people who turned the impossible into the immutable. At first glance, those graceful stone arms curving away from a Gothic cathedral might look like architectural decorations, but in reality, they're the hidden heroes holding the entire structure together. Flying buttresses didn't just add drama to the skyline, they performed a structural ballet, catching the roof's outward thrust and redirecting it down into massive piers rooted deep in the earth. Picture a tree spreading its roots to withstand a storm, except here, the roots leap through the air in elegant arcs, transforming what had once been thick, windowless walls into delicate skeletons of stone. The magic lay in the physics. Traditional walls bore the roof's weight straight downward, requiring sheer bulk to stay standing. But Gothic builders realized they could outsmart gravity by splitting the load. Ribbed vaults overhead acted like stone spiderwebs, channeling forces along slender ribs that converged at key points precisely targeted by the flying buttresses. Suddenly, walls could dissolve into vast expanses of stained glass because the real work of holding up the building happened outside in those daring stone leaps. Chartres Cathedral showcases this revolution perfectly. Its nave soars 120 feet, as tall as a 12-story building, yet its walls are barely thicker than a modern bookshelf. That verticality wasn't just impressive, it was spiritual. The higher the vaults climbed, the closer worshippers felt to heaven, their gaze pulled upward by lines that seemed to defy earthly logic. Even the buttresses played their part in this celestial choreography, their upward curves mirroring the vaults inside, creating a rhythm of thrust and counterthrust that turned architecture into frozen motion. But innovation never comes without risk. Early experiments with these techniques sometimes ended in catastrophe. When the choir of Bovey's Cathedral, ambitiously pushing toward an unprecedented 157 feet, collapsed in 1284, it was a grim reminder that ambition could outpace understanding. Builders responded not by retreating but by refining. They thickened piers, added secondary buttresses, even embedded iron rods within the stone like hidden armor. At Rheims Cathedral, you can still see the scars of trial and error patches where masons rebuilt sections after partial collapses, each failure making the next attempt stronger. What's often forgotten is how these innovations transformed the experience of sacred space. Before flying buttresses, churches felt like protective caves, low ceilings, small windows, thick walls. Gothic cathedrals, by contrast, were lanterns of light. With their weight-bearing duties shifted to external supports, walls became canvases for stained glass on an unprecedented scale. At Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, 15 towering windows contain over 1,000 biblical scenes, their colors dissolving the stone into a radiant haze. Worshippers didn't just see stories in glass, they stood inside a jewel, bathed in hues meant to evoke the celestial city. Yet for all their ethereal beauty, these structures were rooted in earthy pragmatism. Buttresses had to be precisely angled too steep, and they'd fail to catch the thrust, too shallow, and they'd waste material. Masons calculated these angles using geometry passed down through generations, often laying out full-scale templates on tracing floors. And the vaults, their ribs weren't just decorative, they acted like stone highways, directing forces predictably to awaiting buttresses. It was a system so balanced that removing a single element could bring the whole thing down, which makes their survival through wars, fires, and centuries of weather all the more astonishing. Today, when engineers analyze these cathedrals with laser scanners and 3D modeling, they find margins of error smaller than modern construction standards allow. Those medieval builders, working with ropes and chisels, achieved precision we'd struggle to match even with digital tools. Perhaps that's the real lesson of the flying buttress. True brilliance doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's the quiet innovations, the ones that lift others higher, that change the world. Even the grandest dreams sometimes crumble literally. The story of medieval cathedrals isn't just one of soaring triumphs. It's also a chronicle of heartbreaking collapses, miscalculations, and setbacks that could have ended the Gothic Revolution before it truly began. Take Bovey's Cathedral, a monument to both ambition and hubris. In 1284, after decades of labor, its choir vaults pushed to an unprecedented 157 feet, crashed to the ground in a roar of shattered stone. The disaster wasn't just structural, it was spiritual. This was meant to be the tallest cathedral in Christendom, a beacon of divine glory. Instead, it became a cautionary tale etched in rubble. Yet failure often teaches more than success. The collapse forced builders to confront the limits of their knowledge. They discovered that height alone wasn't enough. Stability required balance. At Bovis, the original flying buttresses had been too slender, their angles too steep to properly channel the roof's outward thrust. When reconstruction began, the masons thickened the piers, added secondary buttresses, and even embedded iron rods within the stone medieval reinforcement bars to prevent history from repeating itself. The repaired choir still stands today, a testament to the power of learning from disaster. Other catastrophes were less dramatic but equally devastating. Lincoln Cathedral's central tower collapsed in 1237, likely due to unstable foundations. Wells Cathedral's famous scissor arches weren't a stylistic choice but a desperate fix when the tower began sinking centuries after construction. Each collapse sent ripples across Europe as master builders exchanged letters and traveling craftsmen spread hard-won lessons. Guilds updated their rule books, and new cathedrals incorporated these painful insights: wider piers, shallower vault angles, more robust buttressing. But not all setbacks came from physics. Wars froze construction for generations, like at Cologne Cathedral, where work halted for nearly 300 years after the Archbishop's funds were diverted to military campaigns. The Black Death emptied quarries and workshops, leaving half-finished naves to weather untended. And then there was the ever-present specter of money running out. At Strasbourg, townspeople reportedly sold their jewelry to keep construction going, only for a fire to gut the wooden framework, undoing years of progress in a single night. What's remarkable isn't that these projects faltered, but that they continued at all. When Salisbury Cathedral's spire began leaning dangerously in the 14th century, builders didn't tear it down, they reinforced it with iron chains hidden within the stone, a medieval bracing system still holding today. At Milan Cathedral, generations of architects argued over designs, leading to a hodgepodge of styles. Yet the city persisted, turning compromise into a strange kind of harmony. These struggles reveal a truth often lost in the glow of stained glass. Cathedrals weren't inevitable. They were gambles, won through stubbornness as much as skill. Every time a tower fell or coffers emptied, communities faced a choice: abandon the dream or dig deeper. That they consistently chose the latter speaks to something beyond faith or pride. It was a collective refusal to let temporary failures define permanent legacies. And in that refusal, they gifted us more than buildings. They left a blueprint for resilience written in stone. Now consider the practical miracle that kept these projects alive through all this turmoil: money. How did medieval towns, with no banks, no bonds, no modern financing, marshal the staggering resources needed to build these stone mountains? The answer lies in a mix of piety, persuasion, and creative economics that transformed coins into cathedrals. Building a cathedral wasn't just an act of faith, it was an economic marathon that could bankrupt kings and beggar towns. Imagine a single project consuming more wealth than the annual income of entire kingdoms, stretching across generations like a financial relay race where the baton was passed from grandparents to grandchildren. Where did these staggering sums come from? The answer lies in a patchwork of funding as intricate as the stained glass these coins would eventually buy. At the top stood the church itself, with bishops and abbots dipping into their deep coffers. A single wealthy prelate like Maurice de Sully, who kickstarted Notre Dame de Paris, could pledge years of diocesan revenues. But even ecclesiastical fortunes weren't bottomless. That's where royal patrons stepped in. Kings like Louis IX of France saw cathedral building as both pious duty and political theater. Their donations bought divine favor while impressing subjects with munificence. Some gifts were breathtakingly specific: Henry III of England once donated enough oak trees from royal forests to rebuild Westminster Abbey's roof, each trunk handpicked for straightness and strength. Yet the real financial heavy lifting often fell on ordinary townspeople. Through tithes, a mandatory 10% tax on income, peasants and merchants alike funded stones they'd never see set in place. But beyond obligation, there was fervor. Pilgrims flocked to construction sites, dropping coins into collection boxes for the chance to witness God's work unfolding. At Chartres, when fire destroyed the old cathedral in 1194, townspeople reportedly harnessed themselves to carts hauling stone from quarries miles away, their sweat becoming a form of prayer. Then came the spiritual incentives. The church offered indulgences, reductions in purgatory time for donations, a celestial crowdfunding campaign that turned coins into heavenly currency. Relics supercharged this economy. When Amiens Cathedral acquired the head of John the Baptist, or so they claimed, donations poured in from pilgrims eager to buy both salvation and a glimpse of the sacred skull. But money flowed out as fast as it came in. Quarry rights, skilled labor, and imported materials bled budgets dry. The lead for Reims Cathedral's roof came from English mines, shipped across the channel at enormous cost. Stained glass required not just artisans but rare minerals, cobalt for blue, gold for ruby red, each hue a small fortune. No wonder some projects stalled for decades when funds evaporated. Lincoln Cathedral's central tower stood half-built for 40 years until wool merchants, grown rich from the trade, bankrolled its completion. The accounting itself was a marvel. Clerks tracked every penny in ledgers that still survive, their inked pages revealing a world where faith and finance were inseparable. At York Minster, records show payments for everything from 20 barrels of beer for the masons to 150 pigeons to feed the carvers. These weren't just receipts, they were snapshots of a community all in on a shared dream. What emerges is a paradox. These stone embodiments of divine perfection were funded by thoroughly human means, generosity and guilt, pride and pragmatism. When we admire a cathedral spire today, we're not just seeing stone, we're seeing the collective sacrifice of thousands who believed some debts were worth incurring, both on earth and in heaven. And speaking of sacrifice, consider the hands that turned those coins into beauty. Beyond the financiers and the faithful stood the artists, the glassmakers, sculptors, and painters who transformed raw materials into something transcendent. Their workshops hummed with alchemy, turning sand into light and stone into scripture. Step into a Gothic cathedral at noon, and you don't just see the stained glass, you feel it. Light doesn't merely pass through those windows, it transforms, becoming liquid sapphire, molten ruby, and honeyed gold as it spills across the stone floors. This wasn't just artistry, it was alchemy. Medieval glassmakers knew their craft as a sacred science, mixing sand with powdered metals to conjure colors that seemed ripped from the heavens. Cobalt oxide blazed into deep blues, copper flashed emerald or crimson depending on the furnace's heat, and gold chloride, precious as the metal itself, yielded a red so luminous it was reserved for the robes of Christ and martyrs. Process began in workshops where men breathed air thick with powdered glass and charcoal smoke. Molten glass was blown into spheres, then spun into flat discs called crown glass, their edges thicker and rippled like frozen waves. These panes weren't uniform sheets but organic textures that caught light differently at every hour. Master glaziers then cut them into shapes with red-hot irons, piecing together biblical scenes like a jigsaw puzzle where every fragment had to fit perfectly. Lead strips bent into slender lines called cames framed each piece, creating a web of darkness that made the colors blaze even brighter. But these windows were more than pretty pictures. They were the poor man's Bible. In an age when most couldn't read, stained glass preached in a universal language. At Chartres, the Good Samaritan window taught mercy through shards of glass that turned his cloak azure as he bent over the wounded traveler. At Canterbury, the martyrdom of Thomas Becket unfolded in vivid panels, his blood rendered in glass so red it seemed to pulse. Even the placement held meaning. North windows, starved of direct light, often depicted the stern Old Testament, while sun-drenched southern windows blazed with New Testament grace. The engineering was as meticulous as the theology. These mosaics of glass and lead had to withstand centuries of wind and weather. Craftsmen reinforced them with iron armatures hidden in the stone, like invisible hands cradling the weight. And when storms threatened, some cathedrals employed a radical solution: temporary wooden shutters that could be lowered over the windows, shielding their jeweled brilliance from hail and gales. Yet the true magic lay in their interaction with light. Morning sun set the western windows afire, casting elongated apostles across the nave floor. By afternoon, eastern panels glowed like banked coals, their colors deepening as the angle shifted. On overcast days, the glass turned muted and introspective, as if the stories themselves were whispering. For medieval worshippers, this wasn't just symbolism, it was sacrament. They believed the light passing through those windows was quite literally divine, a physical manifestation of God's grace washing over them. And then there were the hidden touches. Look closely at some medieval glass, and you'll find playful imperfections: a green-edged leaf where it should be blue, a saint's face slightly lopsided. These weren't mistakes, they were signatures. Glassmakers sometimes left intentional flaws as reminders of human fallibility, ensuring no window ever rivaled God's perfection. From the quarry's grit to the glassmaker's furnace, every step in creating these windows was an act of devotion. Today, when we stand beneath them, we're not just seeing colors, we're witnessing frozen light, a 1,000-year-old conversation between earth and sky. And just as these artisans turned sand into scripture, their contemporaries were performing another miracle, breathing life into cold stone through sculptures that seemed to weep, smile, and whisper from their niches. High above the cathedral's bustling construction site, perched on scaffolds that swayed with every gust of wind, stone carvers transformed lifeless rock into faces that seemed to breathe. These weren't mere decorations, they were a celestial cast of saints, angels, and prophets. Each chisel marked a silent sermon in stone. Picture a sculptor crouched before a block of limestone, his mallet and chisel dancing to a rhythm only he could hear, coaxing out a saint's gentle smile or a demon's twisted snarl. The tools were simple: iron points for rough shaping, toothed chisels for delicate folds in robes, drills to pierce pupils that would glint with sunlight, but the results were nothing short of miraculous. Take the famous smiling angel of Rheims Cathedral, her serene expression carved so tenderly that 8 centuries haven't erased her joy, or the grimacing grotesques of Notre Dame, their exaggerated features serving as both rainspouts and warnings against vanity. Every figure had a purpose. Saints lining the portals welcomed worshippers with outstretched hands, their carved robes flowing as if stirred by divine wind. Gargoyles, though often mistaken for mere monsters, were masterpieces of engineering, their gaping mouths channeling torrents of rainwater away from fragile walls, turning practical necessity into theatrical flourish. The true genius lay in how these sculptures lived with the building. Unlike modern statues bolted on as afterthoughts, medieval carvings grew from the cathedral's bones. A column might swell into a saint's robed form, a capital blossom into a foliage-wrapped face. At Amiens, the Bovey statue stands with one foot resting on a crouching demon, a visual pun where the supporting pedestal is the vanquished evil, structure and symbolism fused seamlessly. Yet for all their artistry, these carvers worked in anonymity. Few signed their creations, leaving clues only in subtle quirks, a signature fold of drapery, a distinctive way of carving curls. Some masons even embedded personal jokes. At Lincoln Cathedral, a mischievous imp grins from a shadowy corner, likely the work of an apprentice testing his skills. But anonymity didn't mean indifference. Hidden high on buttresses where only birds might see them, carvers still lavished attention on details. A meticulously carved belt buckle, a lock of hair caught mid-sway, proof that excellence was its own reward. The process itself was a high-wire act. Unlike studio sculptors, cathedral carvers often worked in situ, their scaffolds swaying in the wind as they shaped stones already set in the wall. Mistakes couldn't be undone. A slipped chisel might mean weeks of labor lost, and the materials fought back. Limestone wore down tools quickly, demanding constant resharpening, while harder marbles required Herculean effort. Yet from this struggle emerged expressions so vivid they seemed to whisper across the centuries. Perhaps most astonishing is how these figures changed with their audience. To a peasant gazing up from the square, the facade's towering Christ might inspire awe with his outstretched arms, but climb to the triforium, and you discover the same statue's gently downcast eyes, carved to meet the gaze of wealthy donors who funded its creation. This wasn't just art, it was visual theology tailored to every viewer. Now, shift your gaze from stone to wood, because while sculptures adorned the surface, it was the cathedral's hidden wooden skeleton that held everything together. Behind every vaulted ceiling lay a forest's worth of timber, shaped by carpenters whose names history forgot, but whose craftsmanship still shoulders the weight of history. Beneath the soaring stone vaults of every great cathedral lay another hidden marvel, the vast wooden roof that shielded it from storms, snow, and scorching sun. While masons shaped the bones of these sacred spaces, carpenters worked their own magic overhead, turning ancient oaks into frameworks so sturdy they've carried the weight of centuries. Imagine the journey of a single timber, felled in a forest 50 miles away, its bark stripped by axes, then floated down river on a slow, watery pilgrimage to the construction site. There, master carpenters would scrutinize its grain, marking where each cut should fall to harness the wood's natural strength. Seasoning was sacred, green wood warped and cracked, so beams might air dry for years before earning their place in the cathedral's crown. The designs they crafted were feats of geometry as precise as any stone arch. Interlocking trusses, triangular frameworks of beams spanned nave widths that would challenge modern builders, all without a single iron nail. Instead, carpenters relied on mortise and tenon joints, wooden pegs, and the sheer genius of compression. At Ely Cathedral, the 14th century octagon tower stands as a wooden miracle. 8 massive beams meet at a central hub, their angles calculated so perfectly that the structure has defied gravity for 700 years. Walk beneath it, and you'll see no columns breaking the space, just airy lightness where wood holds up stone like an open hand. But this marriage of timber and stone came with peril. Fire was the silent nightmare haunting every craftsman. The great roof of Canterbury Cathedral burned in 1174, sending molten lead cascading like silver rain onto the choir below. Chartres lost its roof in 1194, the flames so fierce they cracked the very stones. Each disaster forced rebuilds, but carpenters turned tragedy into progress. At York Minster, after a 14th century fire, builders spaced beams farther apart to slow future flames spread, while at Rheims they packed the attic with fire-resistant clay between timber layers. The true test came during construction itself. Picture carpenters balancing on narrow beams 100 feet above the ground, their hammers swinging as they fitted joints midair. Scaffolding was minimal, just enough to hold workers, not the structure. Instead, they built the roof piece by piece, each new beam locking into the last until the whole assembly became self-supporting. The final act was often raising the ridge beam, the spine of the roof, in a ceremony accompanied by prayers and sometimes even a coin nailed beneath it for luck. Hidden within these wooden skeletons are stories the timber itself remembers. Dendrochronology, the science of reading tree rings, reveals that some beams came from oaks already centuries old when felled. At Notre Dame, analysis showed trees had grown slowly in dense forests, their tight rings yielding uncommonly strong wood. Other cathedrals used wind-blown oaks, trees toppled by storms but left alive for decades, their wood uniquely flexible from fighting the elements. Yet for all their resilience, these roofs bore silent witness to the human cost of cathedral building. When a beam slipped or a scaffold gave way, the fall was often fatal. Guild records speak of widows compensated with a year's wages, of apprentices buried with their tools. The very height that made cathedrals glorious also made them deadly, a paradox not lost on the workers who signed their names on hidden beam ends, not with pride, but as a record should disaster strike. And strike it did. Beyond accidents, the sheer scale of labor took its toll. Generations of carpenters spent lifetimes shaping beams they'd never see installed, knowing completion might come long after their hands could no longer hold a chisel. The wood they worked became a ledger of sacrifice, each scorch mark from a careless torch, each notch from a misjudged cut, a reminder that perfection was as elusive as the spires they helped raise. Now shift your gaze downward from those soaring roofs to the ground beneath your feet, where another group of unsung heroes toiled. The story of cathedrals isn't just about those who built upward, but those who dug deep, the quarrymen, the mortar mixers, the laborers who prepared the stage upon which this stone ballet would unfold. Theirs was a world of mud and blisters, where the cathedral's glory was paid for in calluses and grit. Dawn at the construction site began with aching muscles and the smell of damp stone. Workers climbed rickety ladders before the sun fully rose, their breath fogging in the chill morning air as they took their places on scaffolds lashed together with rope and hope. There were no safety harnesses, no hard hats, just calloused hands gripping wooden planks slick with dew. A misstep could mean a fall of 50 feet or more, and medical help amounted to a barber surgeon with a flask of ale and a bone saw. Broken limbs often healed crooked if they healed at all. Yet these men returned day after day, year after year, their lives measured in chisel strokes and mortar lines. The rhythm of labor never paused for weather. Summer sun turned scaffolds into ovens, baking workers in their own sweat as they hauled stones heavier than themselves. Winter brought numb fingers and treacherous ice on the ropes, yet carving continued, frost clinging to beards as masons blew on stiff hands to keep them limber. Rain soaked through wool tunics, turning workspaces into mudslides, but quotas had to be met. Guild rules dictated precise daily progress. A carver might be required to finish a certain number of decorative leaves, while a mason had to set 10 stones perfectly level before dusk. Falling behind meant docked wages, or worse, losing one's place to a hungrier apprentice. Yet within this grueling existence flickered moments of camaraderie. At midday, crews gathered around makeshift hearths, sharing bread, cheese, and stories from distant hometowns. Young apprentices, some no older than 12, learned by fetching tools and mixing mortar, earning hazing and hard-won praise in equal measure. Women, though rarely mentioned in records, were present too. Wives selling ale or mending clothes, daughters carrying water to parched workers, widows grinding pigments for stained glass. The site wasn't just a workplace, it was a village unto itself, with all the gossip, rivalries, and occasional fistfights that entailed. hidden beneath the sweat and toil was a quiet rebellion against anonymity. Masons carved tiny symbols into their stones: a star, a crossed hammer, a stylized animal, signatures meant to say, "I was here." These marks, invisible once the stone was set, became a secret language between craftsmen across generations. Centuries later, restorers at Canterbury Cathedral found a crude sketch of a bishop with donkey ears tucked behind a column, likely an apprentice's joke at a foreman's expense. Such glimpses remind us that these builders weren't faceless drones. They were people who laughed, grumbled, and took pride in work that would outlive them by centuries. Faith was the glue that held this fragile world together. Many workers believed their labor literally built a stairway to heaven, each stone a prayer in physical form. On feast days, they processed through the unfinished nave, candles flickering against raw walls, singing hymns that echoed in the vaults they'd yet to complete. When accidents claimed lives, as they often did, the dead were buried in consecrated ground near the cathedral, their graves oriented toward the rising sun as a promise of resurrection. In an age when most peasants' lives vanished without a trace, these craftsmen left behind monuments that still whisper their names. And then there were the wages. Contrary to romantic myths, cathedral work wasn't purely voluntary. Skilled masons earned decent pay, sometimes even receiving bonuses for dangerous tasks like carving high on towers, but laborers scraped by on meager sums. Payment often came in a mix of coins, bread, and ale, with deductions for broken tools or missed days. Some accounts tell of workers striking over late wages, or masters poaching talent from rival sites with promises of better rations. Yet even when pay was thin, the work continued, perhaps because in a world of plague, war, and fleeting lifespans, building something eternal felt like defiance. The true cost of these cathedrals wasn't measured in gold or stone, but in human resilience. Every soaring vault rests on a foundation of forgotten sacrifices: the carpenter who fell during a roof beam's raising, the glassmaker blinded by furnace sparks, the quarryman crushed beneath a shifting slab. Modern engineers calculate that building Chartres Cathedral required moving enough stone to stack 2 Empire State Buildings, and all of it was done by hands that also held children, kissed wives, and folded in prayer. That tension between the grandeur of the project and the fragility of the people who made it is the cathedral's untold story. Now turn your gaze from the scaffolds to the town square, where another drama unfolded. Because while craftsmen shaped the stones, ordinary townspeople, bakers, merchants, even children played their own part in this epic. Their contributions, though less visible, were just as vital to turning these stone dreams into reality. History often paints cathedral construction as a world of men, masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, but scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find women's hands shaping these stone miracles at every turn. While their names rarely appear in guild records or account books, their influence was woven into the very fabric of these sacred spaces. Take noble women like Elena of Aquitaine, who poured fortunes into rebuilding abbeys, or Countess Blanche of Castile, whose patronage helped complete Chartres Cathedral's soaring north tower. Their wealth opened quarry pits and paid craftsmen's wages, but their involvement wasn't just financial, it was deeply personal. Blanche reportedly visited construction sites, inspecting progress with a keen eye, her presence a quiet defiance of the era's gender norms. Beyond the aristocracy, ordinary women formed the unseen backbone of these projects. In bustling workshop districts near cathedral squares, wives and daughters of masons mixed mortar, sharpened tools, and stitched the heavy gloves that protected their menfolk's hands. At dawn, they hauled baskets of bread and wheels of cheese to site kitchens, fueling the armies of laborers. When accidents happened, and they often did, it was women who boiled linen into bandages, brewed pain-numbing tansy tea and kept vigil by flickering candlelight as injured workers fought fevers. Their labor didn't end when the sun set. Nights were spent mending torn tunics by firelight, their needles dancing to the rhythm of snoring children. Then there were the exceptions, women who stepped beyond supportive roles into the crafts themselves. Sabina von Steinbach's legend lingers at Strasbourg Cathedral, where tradition claims she carved some of the delicate statues adorning its facade after her father, Master Mason Erwin von Steinbach, passed. Whether fact or folklore, the story hints at a hidden reality. Some daughters learned their father's trades despite guild restrictions. Elsewhere, women's fingerprints surface in subtler ways: the distinctive stitching on leather masons' aprons, the unique patterns of stained glass leading that match regional embroidery styles, even the floral motifs on capitals that mirror herb gardens tended by convent nuns. Perhaps their greatest contribution was in the intangible, the social glue that held these decades-long projects together. When funds ran low, women organized relic processions through towns, their songs and prayers loosening purse strings. They brokered peace between rival guilds over shared meals, their diplomacy as vital as any bishop's decree. And when plagues or famines thinned the workforce, it was often women who kept construction alive by recruiting their sons, brothers, and cousins to fill the gaps. The cathedrals themselves whisper their legacy. High in the triforium of Lincoln Cathedral, a rare medieval graffiti sketch shows a woman holding a carpenter's square, whether tribute, joke, or secret signature, we'll never know. At Exeter, the stained glass laboring windows depict biblical scenes, but the faces of the vineyard workers suspiciously resemble local washerwomen and alewives. These silent nods remind us that while history's spotlight fell on master builders, the light that filled these spaces came from countless unseen hands. And as these stone giants rose, they transformed more than skylines. They reshaped the very towns that birthed them. What began as sacred construction sites soon pulsed with the rhythms of markets, politics, and everyday life, drawing communities into orbits that would redefine medieval society forever. Cathedrals didn't just dominate medieval skylines, they pulsed with the heartbeat of daily life. Step beyond their sacred walls, and you'd find a whirlwind of activity that turned these spiritual monuments into bustling urban engines. Markets sprawled across their porches, where fishmongers hawked the morning's catch alongside merchants selling pilgrim badges stamped with saints' faces. Festivals transformed the square into a carnival of fire-eaters and traveling musicians, while inside, the nave hosted not just sermons but town meetings, royal proclamations, and even courtroom trials. These weren't silent sanctuaries, they were the original multi-purpose spaces where the sacred and the secular collided in glorious chaos. The economic ripple effect was staggering. Pilgrims flocking to venerate relics needed food, lodging, and souvenirs, creating boomtowns overnight. Chartres became a medieval tourist trap thanks to its famed Virgin's tunic, while Santiago de Compostella's streets, lined with hostels and scallop shell vendors, still bear witness to the Camino's ancient pull. Local bakers, brewers, and candle makers thrived, supplying the constant stream of visitors, and farmers from miles away diverted crops to feed the hungry masses. Even the cathedral's construction site was an economic powerhouse, demanding everything from quarried stone to barrels of ale for thirsty laborers. Entire industries sprouted to serve its needs. Education flourished in these stone universities. Long before Oxford or Cambridge existed, cathedral schools like Notre Dame's trained scholars in everything from theology to astronomy. Bright-eyed boys and occasionally girls studied beneath clerics who scribbled geometry lessons on slates, their classrooms often tucked in cloisters where the acoustics carried whispers of knowledge across centuries. These schools didn't just produce priests, They minted the thinkers who'd later shape Europe's intellectual renaissance. Yet the cathedral's greatest power was how it rewrote a town's identity. Before Rheims had its soaring towers, it was just another Frankish settlement. But once kings were crowned there and pilgrims trekked to its altars, the city became inseparable from its sacred silhouette. The same happened at Canterbury, where Becket's murder turned a regional church into a destination that drew Chaucer's tales and monarchs' pennants. Townspeople wore their cathedral's fame like a badge, boasting of its spire's height, its relics' potency, its choir's harmonies. This symbiosis explains why communities mortgaged their futures for these projects. A cathedral wasn't just a house of worship, it was a civic resume, advertising a town's wealth, piety, and ambition to the world. When the spire of Strasbourg Cathedral finally pierced the clouds in 1439, the message was clear. This was no backwater, but a player on Europe's stage. But beneath all the commerce and prestige lay something deeper, a spiritual blueprint etched into every arch and stained glass pane. The cathedral's physical grandeur was merely the vessel for a far more profound vision, to map heaven itself onto earthly stone. Every curve, every column, every pane of glass in a Gothic cathedral whispered sacred truths to those who knew how to listen. The building itself was a sermon in stone, its very geometry preaching to illiterate and scholar alike. Take the floor plan, a Latin cross stretching toward the heavens, its long nave forming the body of Christ, the transept's outstretched arms, the altar positioned where his wounded heart would be. Pilgrims walking that path weren't just moving through space, they were retracing the Passion, their footsteps a silent prayer. Light played its own divine role. As dawn broke, the eastern apse where the altar stood would flood with golden rays, transforming the Eucharist into a spectacle of resurrection. This wasn't just pretty symbolism, it was physics as theology. Medieval builders aligned entire cathedrals with celestial precision, ensuring the sun's journey mirrored salvation's story. At solstice, certain churches like Chartres become solar calendars, light-piercing specific windows to illuminate hidden carvings, as if God himself were turning the pages of a stone Bible. Look up, and the vaults told another tale. The ribbed ceilings weren't merely structural, they mapped the cosmos, their intersecting arcs mirroring the harmony of creation. 3 levels of elevation, ground floor, triforium, clerestory mirrored the medieval worldview, earthly toil below, the realm of angels and saints above, and finally, heaven's glory in the dizzying heights. Even the columns had voices bundled together like saints in communion, their unified strength supporting the weight of the sacred. Numbers held magic. 12 apostles might be echoed in 12 lancet windows, while 7, the number of sacraments, appeared in choir stalls or chapel niches. At Amiens, the labyrinth inlaid in the nave floor measured precisely 1/3 the length of the church's height, a hidden equation balancing human effort and divine grace. These weren't arbitrary choices, they were numerical prayers, equations of devotion etched in stone. Then there were the grotesques, those sly stone creatures lurking on rainspouts and capitals. While some see them as mere decoration or superstition, theologians argue they served a deeper purpose. By placing demons and monsters outside the sacred space, often scowling as they vomited rainwater, builders visualized evil's expulsion from God's house. Even the cathedral's imperfections whispered lessons. A deliberately crooked line in a mosaic might remind worshippers that only God achieves perfection. This symbolic language wasn't confined to one region. It became a visual dialect spoken across Europe. From the sun-drenched aisles of Spain's Leon Cathedral to the fog-wrapped towers of England's York Minster, the same theological grammar shaped local interpretations. French builders might emphasize verticality to draw eyes heavenward, while German masons favored dramatic spires that pierced the clouds like Jacob's ladder. Yet whether in honey-colored keen stone or the ruddy sandstone of Strasbourg, the message remained: every arch was an echo of eternity, every window a gateway to the divine. The true genius of these designs lies in their democracy. A peasant who couldn't read a psalm could still grasp salvation's story written in sunlight and shadow. A merchant counting coins in the nave would glance up to see the Last Judgment carved above the doors, a silent admonition against greed. Even children, craning their necks at gargoyles, learned that faith was both shelter and adventure, a fortress with its doors flung wide. And so the stones kept preaching long after the builder's hands had turned to dust. Today, when we trace a finger along a weathered capital or pause in a pool of stained glass light, we're not just seeing medieval artistry, we're eavesdropping on an ancient conversation between earth and heaven, one that needed no words to be understood. This silent language of symbols didn't stay put, it traveled, morphing and adapting as it crossed borders. The next chapter of our story unfolds along muddy pilgrim roads and windswept trade routes, where ideas moved as freely as merchants' carts. The Gothic Revolution didn't stay confined to the workshops of Île-de-France for long. It spilled across borders like water, finding cracks in stone, carried by the calloused hands of itinerant masons and the ambitions of bishops who wanted their own slice of heaven on earth. Picture a master builder from Chartres packing his compass and templates, trudging along muddy pilgrim roads to Cologne or Canterbury, where local stone awaited his transformative touch. These wandering craftsmen were the unsung diplomats of style, their knowledge traded like currency in a Europe hungry for the new, the daring, the divine. England embraced the Gothic wave with a twist where French cathedrals shot skyward like stone arrows. English architects stretched their naves into sweeping horizontals, creating spaces that felt like grand processions frozen in stone. Salisbury Cathedral, rising from water meadows with its honey-colored limestone, became a masterclass in this elongated elegance. Its spire, added later, remains the tallest in Britain, but it's the cathedral's sprawling cloisters and chapter house that whisper England's unique take on the style. Meanwhile, at Wells Cathedral, the iconic scissor arches weren't some artistic whim. They were a desperate and genius fix when the tower began sinking centuries after construction, proving Gothic was as much about problem-solving as beauty. Germany took the French blueprint and cranked it up to dizzying new heights. Cologne Cathedral's twin spires, finally completed in 1880 after 6 centuries of fits and starts, claw at the sky like petrified flames. But the real marvel lies in the details. Its flying buttresses are more delicate than lace. Its choir stalls a forest of carved oak teeming with saints and sinners. Further east, Prague's St. Vitus Cathedral showcases the flamboyant Sondergothic style, where vaults twist into net-like patterns and windows flame upward in jagged peaks, as if the stone itself had caught fire. Spain's Gothic story is drenched in sunlight and cultural crosscurrents. At Burgos Cathedral, Moorish influences peek through in star-patterned vaults and intricate filigree, a silent nod to the Iberian Peninsula's blended heritage. But it's Seville's cathedral that steals the show, built on the footprint of a demolished mosque, its minaret repurposed into the Giralda bell tower. Inside, the world's largest Gothic altarpiece gleams with enough gold to make a king blush, each panel crammed with biblical drama. Here, Gothic wasn't just imported, it was reinvented, infused with the heat and intensity of the Spanish soul. Even lands without quarries found ways to join the movement. In Poland's brick-rich north, red Gothic churches like Malbork Castle's chapel rose like embers against snow. Sweden's Uppsala Cathedral, built with local sandstone, swapped flying buttresses for thick walls to withstand Baltic winters. Everywhere the style touched, it bent, not broke, to local realities. What fueled this wildfire spread? Prestige played its part. No bishop wanted to be outdone by his neighbor. But the deeper truth lies in the guild's secretive yet surprisingly mobile networks. A mason trained at Rheims might teach apprentices in Vienna, his knowledge passed like a baton across generations. Pattern books circulated too, their pages crammed with sketches of French arches or English tracery, becoming medieval Pinterest boards for hungry minds. And when royals married across borders, they brought architects in their retinues, like when Elena of Castile introduced French builders to England, forever changing Westminster Abbey's skyline. The result wasn't uniformity, but a glorious cacophony, a single architectural language spoken in 100 dialects. Today, when we crane our necks at Strasbourg's lace-like facade or lose ourselves in Gloucester Cathedral's fan-vaulted cloisters, we're witnessing more than stone. We're seeing the fingerprints of countless anonymous hands who believed beauty shouldn't have borders and built accordingly. Chartres Cathedral doesn't just dominate the skyline, it whispers secrets. Walk its nave and your feet trace an ancient labyrinth embedded in the floor, a winding path once trod by pilgrims on their knees, seeking enlightenment one painful step at a time. Above them, the famed blue Virgin window glows with a hue so celestial it's said to have been divinely inspired, while below the crypt hides a relic even more precious, the Sancta Camisa, believed to be the Virgin Mary's own tunic. Legend claims it survived a devastating fire in 1294 unscathed, a miracle that turned Chartres into a beacon for the faithful. But the real magic lies in the details, like the way the cathedral's west facade aligns with the summer solstice sun, or how its mismatched towers, one plain, one ornate, tell a tale of rival benefactors and unfinished ambitions. Not a Dame de Paris wears its drama in plain sight. Before flames scarred its roof in 2019, this cathedral had already survived revolutions, wars, and even a plot to dismantle it stone by stone. Victor Hugo's Hunchback wasn't just fiction. The novel's success sparked a 19th-century restoration that resurrected gargoyles from neglect and gave us the iconic spire that later fell in the fire. Beneath its flying buttresses lie older secrets. The site was once a Roman temple, then a Merovingian church, each layer echoing Paris's metamorphosis from pagan outpost to medieval powerhouse. Cologne Cathedral's twin spires tell a different story, one of stubborn perseverance. Begun in 1248, it stood incomplete for nearly 300 years, its skeletal choir open to the elements until Prussian Romantics bankrolled its finish in the 1800s. The original medieval crane, left rusting on the south tower for centuries, became a symbol of the city's determination. Even World War II couldn't break it. Though bombs reduced the surrounding city to rubble, the cathedral's frame miraculously endured, its surviving stained glass removed brick by brick for safekeeping before the Blitz. What unites these icons isn't just their grandeur, but their resilience. Salisbury Cathedral's clock, the world's oldest working mechanical timepiece, has ticked through plagues and wars since 1386. Canterbury's crypt shelters graffiti from 12th century pilgrims, their scratched crosses still visible where they camped awaiting blessings. And at Santiago de Compostela, the portico of glory's central column bears the handprint of countless worshippers who have touched its worn marble over 800 years, their collective faith eroding the stone into smooth hollows. Yet for all their legends, these buildings were shaped by tools far humbler than their spires suggest. Behind every miracle of stone and glass lay the chisels, compasses, and crude cranes that turned vision into reality, instruments as ordinary as they were indispensable. The tools of medieval cathedral builders might look primitive to modern eyes, simple iron and wood, worn smooth by generations of hands, but in their clever design lies a brilliance that rivals any digital gadget. Take the humble compass, its twin metal legs scratching precise circles into limestone slabs. This wasn't just for drawing, it was a geometric wizard, allowing masons to calculate complex rib vault intersections or plot the exact curvature of an arch with nothing but a pivot and a steady hand. Pair it with a square, its right angle perfected by trial and error, and suddenly you had the medieval equivalent of CD software tools that could translate sacred geometry from parchment to stone with jaw-dropping accuracy. Chisels tell another story of quiet innovation. Blacksmiths forged them in graduated sets, from broad, drove chisels for rough shaping to needle-thin points for delicate tracery. Each blow of the mallet was a calculated risk. Too hard, and the stone might split. Too soft, and hours of labor would stretch into days. Masters taught apprentices to listen to the sound of the strike, the pitch of metal on stone revealing hidden flaws in the material. And when a chisel dulled, workers sharpened it on water-fed grinding stones, their rhythmic scraping a constant soundtrack on the site. But perhaps the most poetic tools were those that harnessed the earth itself. A plumb line, just a weight on a string, became a cathedral's spinal cord, ensuring every wall climbed straight as a prayer toward heaven. Levels, often nothing more than wood with a water-filled groove, guaranteed floors lay even enough to make a rolling marble stop dead. These weren't crude implements, they were elegantly precise, their simplicity belying the sophistication of their use. The real magic happened when these tools converged. Picture a master mason pressing his forehead against a stone block, one eye squinting along a string line while his fingers adjusted a wooden template. Behind him, an apprentice cranked a treadwheel crane, its groaning ropes lifting a carved capital into place with inch-perfect alignment. Every action was a dance of physics and faith, where a misaligned plumb bob or a warped square could spell disaster 3 stories up. Yet these builders didn't just work by hand, they worked by the stars. Many cathedrals align with solstice sunrises, their portals designed to catch the first golden rays on feast days. At Chartres, a tiny hole in a south transept window acts like a celestial spotlight, projecting a beam that strikes a specific flagstone only at the summer solstice noon. Such feats required not just tools, but deep astronomical knowledge passed down through guilds, blending science and symbolism into every stone. The absence of modern technology makes their precision all the more astonishing. Laser scans of Notre Dame's vaults revealed deviations of less than half an inch over spans of 100 feet, a margin some contemporary builders struggle to match with satellites and steel. This wasn't luck, it was the culmination of centuries of accumulated wisdom, where each generation refined the tools and techniques of the last. What's often overlooked is how these tools shaped the minds that wielded them. A compass taught geometry through touch, a plumb line made gravity visible, and a mallet's rebound taught the stone's hidden weaknesses. In an age before mass literacy, these were the textbooks that trained Europe's greatest architectural minds. The cathedral wasn't just built with tools, it was built from them, each humble implement a silent partner in the dance between earth and sky. Now, shift your gaze from the workshop to the heavens themselves, where medieval builders found their most enduring inspiration. The next chapter of this story unfolds not in stone, but in starlight, the celestial knowledge that turned cathedrals into frozen hymns to the cosmos. Hidden within the soaring arches and labyrinthine floors of medieval cathedrals lies a silent language, mathematics made manifest in stone. The builders weren't merely stacking blocks, they were encoding the cosmos itself into their designs, guided by the conviction that God had fashioned the universe with geometric perfection. Step into Chartres Cathedral, and your path traces a perfect circle within a square, the labyrinth underfoot mirroring the medieval vision of earthly pilgrimage encircling divine harmony. Above you, the nave's proportions hum with the golden ratio, its columns spaced so precisely that the space seems to breathe with sacred symmetry. This wasn't aesthetic whimsy, it was theology rendered in dimensions, where every line whispered of a celestial order beyond human chaos. The sun played its part in this stone scripture. At solstice dawn, Canterbury Cathedral's eastern windows ignite with light that slants down the nave like a golden arrow, striking the high altar at the exact moment the feast of Thomas Becket begins. In Spain's Leon Cathedral, the Virgen del Dodo window transforms into a celestial spotlight every November 21st, illuminating a hidden statue of Mary with such precision that locals still set their calendars by it. These alignments required more than intuition, they demanded meticulous astronomical observation, the kind usually reserved for monastic star charts. Builders likely used simple tools like astrolabes and shadow sticks, plotting solar trajectories against cathedral walls with the same reverence others reserved for scripture. What's astonishing is how these sacred equations transcended borders. From France's Amiens to England's Wells, the same geometric harmonies recur: aisle widths mirroring choir heights, transept lengths echoing apse curves. Some scholars argue this consistency stems from the ad quadratum method, where master masons based entire floor plans on nested squares and circles, their compasses tracing the same divine proportions whether in limestone or sandstone. Even the vaunted golden ratio, that mystical number governing seashells and galaxies, shapes everything from window tracery to spire angles, as if the builders sought to replicate creation's blueprints. Yet the true marvel lies in how these structures defy time. Salisbury Cathedral's spire, though leaning precariously, has stood for 7 centuries thanks to iron reinforcements medieval masons embedded like hidden sutures. The oak beams supporting Westminster Hall's roof, felled in the 1300s, still bear the marks of Viking-era shipbuilders' axes, their grain so dense they've outlasted empires. Even the stained glass at Chartres, exposed to war and weather since the 12th century, retains colors so vibrant they seem painted yesterday, a testament to lost chemical techniques involving copper oxides and crushed gemstones. Survival often hinged on medieval ingenuity. Flying buttresses weren't just graceful, they redistributed weight so cleverly that many still stand despite centuries of ground settling. Mortar recipes, jealously guarded by guilds, mixed lime with volcanic ash or animal hair for flexibility, allowing walls to shift without shattering. And those labyrinthine crypts beneath cathedrals, they weren't just sacred spaces, they stabilized foundations, their winding passages acting as shock absorbers during earthquakes. The ultimate proof of these builders' genius isn't just that their creations endure, but how they adapt. Notre Dame's near destruction in 2019 revealed iron cramps dating to the 12th century, their rust still holding stones together after 800 years. When Cologne Cathedral's medieval crane finally came down in the 1800s, restorers found timber so resin-rich it had petrified into near indestructibility. These structures seem almost alive, their stones whispering secrets of resilience across the ages, less like relics of the past than living conversations between then and now. As the last light fades from a cathedral's rose window, painting the floor in fractured rubies and sapphires, we're reminded that these buildings were never meant to be static. They pulse with the rhythms of the heavens, bend with the patience of earth, and stand as monuments not just to faith, but to the stubborn human belief that beauty, when crafted with wisdom, can outlast even time itself. Time has not been kind to the stone giants of the Middle Ages. Centuries of rain have dissolved delicate carvings, pollution has blackened once radiant stained glass, and wars have left scars in the form of cannonball pocks and shrapnel marks. Yet against all odds, these cathedrals still stand not as untouched relics, but as living monuments constantly being rescued from the brink. The shocking sight of Notre Dame de Paris engulfed in flames in 2019 laid bare their vulnerability. As the spire collapsed in a shower of embers, the world held its breath. But that tragedy also revealed something extraordinary: the depth of humanity's commitment to preserving these wonders. Within hours, billionaires and schoolchildren alike pledged millions to rebuild, proving these stones still matter in ways their builders could never have imagined. Modern restoration is a delicate dance between past and present. At Canterbury Cathedral, lasers now map every fissure in the stone with millimeter precision, while 3D printers recreate shattered gargoyles using scans of surviving twins. In Cologne, conservators inject nanolime into crumbling mortar, a space-age solution for 800-year-old walls. Yet for all our technology, some challenges still demand medieval solutions. When York Minster's Great East Window needed repair, craftsmen mixed mortar using 13th-century recipes, their trowels moving to the same rhythms as their predecessors. The most vital tool remains the human hand trained in ancient techniques, like the French carvers who spent years relearning lost skills to recreate Notre Dame's oak spire, tree by painstakingly matched tree. The threats evolve, but so does the ingenuity defending against them. Acid rain, unknown to medieval masons, now requires protective coatings on statues that once weathered centuries untouched. Climate change brings stronger storms, forcing engineers to reinforce lead roofs that survived a millennium but may not endure today's erratic gales. Even tourism, the lifeblood of preservation funding, wears away at floors trod by 40 million footsteps a year. The solution: invisible microcrystalline wax coatings on Chartres labyrinth, allowing pilgrims to walk the sacred path without erasing it entirely. What endures through all this is the spirit of the original builders, their willingness to think generations ahead. When restorers pried open a medieval mason's time capsule at Ulm Minster, they found not gold or relics but a simple note: "We built for you." Now it is your turn. That ethic still guides caretakers today, whether they're restitching Bayeux's tapestries thread by thread or using AI to predict how Salisbury's leaning spire will settle over the next century. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in how these restorations honor both past and future. At Dresden's Frauenkirche, destroyed in World War II and rebuilt stone by original stone in the 21st century, the scorched bricks were carefully placed where they'd be most visible, not to dwell on destruction, but to testify to renewal. Similarly, Notre Dame's new spire blends traditional oak with titanium supports, a hybrid that whispers rather than shouts its modernity. The goal is never to freeze these buildings in time, but to let them keep telling their layered stories, charred timbers and laser scans alike becoming part of their evolving saga. And so the work continues, a quiet crusade fought with dental picks and drones instead of chisels and treadwheels. When the last scaffold comes down from Notre Dame's restored facade, it won't mark an ending, but a handoff, another generation assuming the watch over treasures that have weathered plagues, revolutions, and fire. Their survival is no accident. It's a choice we keep making, stone by stone, century by century, proving that what humanity values deeply enough to build, it will find a way to save. The medieval craftsmen left behind more than just stone and glass. They gifted us a blueprint for how to build not just structures, but legacies. Imagine dedicating your life to carving a single column, knowing your grandchildren might be the ones to see it crowned with vaults. This wasn't just patience, it was a radical act of trust in the process, in the community, and in the unseen future. Their collaborations span generations, with masons passing down templates like sacred heirlooms and glassmakers refining techniques over lifetimes. There were no solo geniuses in cathedral construction. Every spire was a chorus of countless voices, each artisan's skill interlocking like the ribs of a vault. What's striking is how seamlessly they married beauty with purpose. Those flying buttresses weren't just engineering marvels, they were stone poetry, their curves echoing the arches they supported. Stained glass transformed sunlight into theology, while gargoyles served as both rainspouts and moral warnings. This holistic vision challenges our modern divide between artists and engineers, reminding us that the most enduring innovations emerge where form and function dance together. Their principles feel startlingly relevant today. Modern architects like Santiago Calatrava openly channel Gothic daring, using steel and glass to create spaces that, like cathedrals, awe and uplift. The Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, though begun in 1882, embodies the medieval spirit, an unfinished symphony where 3D printers now work alongside traditional carvers, proving that slow craftsmanship still has a place in our fast world. Even sustainability lessons emerge. Medieval builders used local stone, passive solar alignment, and materials meant to last centuries, a stark contrast to today's disposable construction. Perhaps their greatest lesson is about scale. In an age obsessed with quarterly results, cathedrals stand as monuments to long-thinking projects that demanded decades of investment without guaranteed returns. Communities poured resources into these ventures not despite their generational timelines, but because of them. There's wisdom here for our climate crisis and infrastructure challenges. Some problems can't be solved in a single lifetime, but must be approached with that same cathedral mindset, laying foundations others will build upon. Now look at a modern skyscraper through this lens. Its glass curtain walls owe a debt to Gothic transparency, its steel skeleton a descendant of ribbed vaults. Architects like Norman Foster cite medieval buildings as inspirations for creating humane, light-filled spaces in urban jungles. The difference: today's tools let us build faster, but not necessarily wiser. Those medieval masons understood something we often forget. True progress isn't just about reaching heights, it's about ensuring they endure. The next time you walk past a construction site, consider the invisible threads connecting today's workers to their medieval forebears. The cranes may be steel instead of wood, the plans digital rather than chalked on tracing floors, but the essential human elements remain: vision, collaboration, and the stubborn belief that ordinary hands can shape the extraordinary. That's the real spire they left us, not just pointing toward heaven, but reminding us what we're capable of when we build together. Echoes of the Gothic spirit ripple through our modern cities, not in the form of pointed arches or flying buttresses, but in the very philosophy that shaped them, the belief that architecture should elevate the human experience. Take the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, where Antoni Gaudí fused medieval devotion with organic modernism. Though construction began in 1882, its ongoing creation mirrors the medieval tradition of generational craftsmanship. Stone carvers still work alongside digital modelers, blending 13th century techniques with 21st century 3D printing, proving that slow, deliberate creation hasn't lost its place in our fast-paced world. But the influence runs deeper than aesthetics. Walk into the light-drenched atrium of a contemporary glass skyscraper, and you're standing in a direct descendant of the Gothic cathedral's luminous nave. Architects like Norman Foster and Renzo Piano owe a debt to those medieval visionaries who first dissolved walls into stained glass. The difference: today's steel skeletons replace stone ribs, and double-paned windows swap for jewel-toned panes, but the intent remains strikingly similar: to flood human spaces with transcendent light. Even the open-plan offices of Silicon Valley echo the cathedral's communal ethos, trading sacred vaults for collaborative workspaces designed to inspire collective creativity. The parallels extend to engineering too. Just as medieval builders redistributed weight through external buttresses, today's towers rely on exoskeletons of diagonal braces and tension cables. The Shard in London or the Burj Khalifa in Dubai might be clad in futuristic materials, but their structural logic channeling forces along precise pathways would feel familiar to the masons of charters. And when seismic engineers embed flexible joints in skyscrapers to withstand earthquakes, they're applying the same principle that let Gothic cathedrals sway slightly in high winds without collapsing. What's most remarkable is how these ancient principles address modern challenges. Passive solar design, now a buzzword in sustainable architecture, was perfected in medieval churches aligned to harness winter light for warmth. The vaulted ceilings of train stations like New York's Oculus don't just evoke cathedral grandeur, they optimize airflow and acoustics, just as Gothic architects did. Even the trend toward adaptive reuse, where old structures find new purposes, mirrors how cathedrals evolved over centuries, absorbing chapels, cloisters, and crypts as needs changed. Yet for all the technical continuity, something intangible lingers. Contemporary architects still chase that elusive quality medieval builders called the sublime, the ability of space to stir awe. When you stand in the shadow of Zaha Hadid's undulating Gwangju Opera House or gaze up at the lattice-like roof of London's King's Cross Station, you're experiencing the same visceral wonder that pilgrims felt stepping into Rheims Cathedral 800 years ago. The materials have changed, but the human response remains unchanged. Historians argue this enduring appeal stems from how cathedrals engage our deepest metaphors. Their verticality speaks to aspiration, their light to enlightenment, their communal spaces to unity. In an age of digital isolation, these physical embodiments of connection and transcendence resonate more powerfully than ever. They remind us that architecture isn't just about shelter. It's about storytelling in stone and steel, weaving narratives that span centuries. The next time you pass a glass-walled office tower glowing like a lantern at dusk, or pause in a museum's vaulted hall, listen closely. You might just hear the whisper of medieval masons still teaching us how to build not just structures but meaning. Historians don't just study cathedrals, they listen to them. These stone giants speak in a language of ambition and endurance, telling us what happens when faith, art, and engineering collide at full force. Take Dr. Emily Gurry, a medieval scholar who describes Chartres Cathedral as a frozen moment of human transcendence. To her, every ribbed vault and stained glass panel isn't just craftsmanship, it's a manifesto. These builders didn't have our technology, she notes, but they had something we've lost, the patience to think in centuries. That patience echoes in the cathedral's very pores. The way 12th century masons mixed iron oxides into mortar for flexibility, or how they aligned the nave to catch solstice light like a sundial. These weren't just construction choices, they were declarations that beauty and function could be married forever. But cathedrals also whisper darker truths. Art historian Professor Jonathan Foyle points to the cracks in the facade literally. Look closely at Lincoln Cathedral's west front, he says, and you'll see patches where medieval masons repaired earthquake damage. They didn't hide these scars, they honored them. For Foyle, this honesty is what makes Gothic architecture so compelling. It's a reminder that even the grandest visions face setbacks, and that resilience is built into their DNA. That resilience resonates today. In an era of planned obsolescence where smartphones are outdated in a year, cathedrals stand as quiet rebels. Their stones have weathered wars, fires, and neglect, yet they still host baptisms, concerts, and protests, proof that great design isn't just about surviving time, but serving it. The human stories etched into these walls are what truly captivate Dr. Sita Chaganti, a specialist in medieval cultural studies. She urges us to look beyond the facades to the fingerprints left by unnamed artisans. At Canterbury, she explains, there's a tiny carving of a mason's handprint near the triforium. His way of saying, "I was here." These personal touches, a wonky gargoyle, a hidden doodle of a peasant's face, reveal the cathedral not as a monolithic institution, but as a tapestry of individual lives. We romanticize the Middle Ages as a time of blind faith, Chaganti reflects, but these builders questioned, improvised, and even joked through their work. That humanity is why their creations still breathe today. What unites these expert views is a shared awe for cathedrals as collaborative miracles. Structural engineer Dr. Robert Schemenauer marvels at how medieval builders engineered without equations, relying on intuition honed over generations. The flying buttress isn't just a support, he explains. It's a stroke of genius that redistributes weight so precisely, modern software confirms its efficiency. His research team laser-scanned Amiens Cathedral and found that its vaults deviate less than an inch from perfect symmetry, a margin some modern architects struggle to achieve with GPS-guided tools. They didn't have calculus, Schemenauer laughs, but they had something better, collective wisdom passed from master to apprentice like a sacred torch. This interplay of faith and pragmatism is what still draws millions to cathedrals yearly, not as relics but as mirrors. When climate activists project melting glaciers onto Notre Dame's facade, or when refugees find shelter in Barcelona's Sagrada Familia, these ancient spaces prove their adaptability. They remind us that true legacy isn't about permanence, but purpose. As the sun sets through York Minster's great east window, painting the stone floor in fractured rainbows, we're left with a question as old as the buildings themselves. What will we create that's worthy of lasting 1,000 years? Now, let's step into the shoes of those who answered that question daily, the ordinary people whose calloused hands and stubborn hope turned impossible dreams into immutable stone. Their names may be lost, but their legacy is written in light and shadow. Whispers cling to cathedral stones like moss, half-heard stories of masons who carved their prayers into hidden corners, of stained glass that glowed without sunlight, of rival guilds sabotaging each other's scaffolds under cover of night. These aren't just folk tales, they're the echoes of real lives preserved in the cracks between history and legend. Consider the tale of Sabina von Steinbach, her name half lost to time, said to have secretly sculpted Strasbourg Cathedral's most delicate statues after her father's death, her chiseled strokes bolder than any woman's were supposed to be. Or the mysterious apprentice pillar at Rosslyn Chapel, its twisted spirals allegedly carved by a boy who dreamed of vines in stone only for the master mason to kill him in a jealous rage, or so the story goes. Guild rivalries simmered beneath the surface of sacred labor. In Exeter's account books, fines levied against masons for defacing another man's mark hint at workshop brawls over stolen designs. At Wells Cathedral, two master builders reportedly dueled with compasses over the correct angle for a vault. Their argument settled only when the bishop threatened to dismiss them both. Even miracles had a competitive edge when Cologne's crane operator fell from the scaffolding. Legend claims the Virgin Mary caught him midair, but York's version insists it was Saint William who cushioned their mason's fall. Then there were the silent rebellions, hidden among Rheims Cathedral's solemn saints. A grinning stone fox clutches a stolen goose, likely a mason's jab at a thieving foreman. High on Lincoln's walls, a tiny imp sticks out its tongue, perhaps an apprentice's revenge for some long-forgotten scolding. These weren't mere decorations. They were protests in limestone, proof that even divine projects couldn't suppress human mischief. The most haunting voices come from the stones themselves. At Canterbury, a worn step near the martyr's shrine bears deep grooves where millions of pilgrim knees ground the rock smooth, their collective longing etched into the floor. In Chartres' crypt, candle smoke has blackened the ceiling over centuries, each wick lit by someone hoping for healing or forgiveness. And at Santiago de Compostela, the portico of glory's central column gleams where countless hands have touched it, the marble hollowed by 800 years of fingertips seeking grace. What endures isn't just the grandeur of these buildings, but their uncanny ability to hold both the sacred and the mundane in perfect balance. They've witnessed coronations and cabbage markets, hosted whispered confessions and children's laughter, sheltered refugees and revelers alike. That's their true power, not as frozen relics, but as living vessels for every human emotion from despair to euphoria. When sunlight spills through York Minster's great east window today, it falls on tourists and worshippers just as it once illuminated medieval faces upturned in wonder. The light hasn't changed, neither has the awe it inspires. Perhaps that's why we still raise our eyes in these spaces, just as our ancestors did. Not because we share their exact beliefs, but because cathedrals speak to something timeless in us. The longing to reach beyond what seems possible, to leave marks that outlast our brief lives, to build bridges between earth and sky. Their stones murmur a truth we instinctively recognize, that the greatest creations emerge not from perfection, but from the messy, glorious collision of human hands and heavenly dreams. The spires that still scrape the sky after 8 centuries are far more than masterpieces of stone. They are mirrors held up to humanity's highest aspirations. Every arch, every pane of glass, every weathered gargoyle whispers the same truth. What we build reveals who we are. These cathedrals were born from an age of plague and warfare, when life was fragile and futures uncertain. Yet rather than hunker down in fear, medieval communities poured their gold, their labor, and their stubborn hope into projects they knew they'd never see completed. That audacity alone should take our breath away. Consider the raw improbability of it all. Teams of laborers who'd never seen a blueprint lifted blocks heavier than oxen 100 feet in the air using ropes and raw muscle. Glassmakers with no understanding of optics concocted hues so vibrant they still glow like trapped sunlight. Architects without calculus or computers engineered vaults that defy gravity through sheer intuition. Their tools were primitive, their risks enormous, yet their vision was limitless. What they achieved wasn't just architecture, it was alchemy, turning faith and perseverance into monuments that outlasted empires. But the real magic lies in how these buildings refuse to become mere relics. Walk into Chartres Cathedral at noon, and you'll see modern pilgrims tracing the same labyrinth medieval feet once walked. The very stones seem alive, absorbing centuries of prayers, tears, and whispered dreams. At York Minster, laser scans now preserve fragile masonry, while drone footage reveals hidden stonemasons' marks to new generations. These aren't frozen artifacts, they're living conversations between past and present, inviting us to add our voices to their ongoing story. What endures isn't just the stones, but the spirit they embody. The willingness to begin something you won't finish, the courage to innovate when failure could mean ruin, the belief that ordinary hands calloused, trembling, imperfect, can shape the extraordinary. That legacy echoes in today's marvels, from the undulating curves of Sydney's Opera House to the space telescopes revealing distant galaxies. The same human impulse that raised cathedrals now builds hospitals, rewields forests, and codes AI to diagnose diseases. The tools change, but the yearning remains to create something bigger than ourselves. So the next time you stand beneath a vaulted ceiling or glimpse a spire through morning mist, remember, you're not just seeing a building. You're witnessing a dare, a challenge flung across centuries, asking what we'll build with our fleeting moment in history. Maybe it won't be stone towers. Perhaps it's a kinder community, a breakthrough invention, or simply a life lived with intention. The medium matters less than the message. That vision plus persistence can bend the arc of time. Now we turn the conversation to you. Which cathedral's story resonates most deeply? Is it the resilience of Notre Dame rising from ashes yet again, the celestial light of Sainte-Chapelle, or maybe the humble beauty of a small village chapel where generations have gathered in quiet devotion? Share your thoughts below, because the greatest cathedrals were never meant to be admired in silence, but to spark dialogues that outlast their stones. After all, that's how legacies truly endure,